Amina Jones, a 17-year-old black girl, was slapped across the face by a white cop in open court, with the judge watching and no one saying a word. 5 minutes later, a woman walked in. Her name was Marcia Jones. She wasn't just Amina's mother, she was with the Department of Justice. They thought Amina was alone. They were dead wrong. What happens when the system tries to silence the daughter? But the mother holds the law in her hands. If this hits you, like, share, and subscribe because the story starts right here. It was the kind of summer heat that made the air in the courtroom feel thick, like it was holding its breath. The fans were spinning overhead but barely moving anything, and the light streaming through the narrow windows struck down harsh and unforgiving, casting hard lines across the polished floor. You could hear the creak of the old wooden benches each time someone shifted, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights that made the silence even heavier. That wasn't a room waiting for truth. That was a room waiting for a verdict already decided. Amina Jones stepped through the double doors like someone who had learned not to flinch. She was 17, thin-framed but steady, with brown skin catching the sweat and heat like it had done this walk before. Her black cotton t-shirt clung slightly to her back, but she didn't adjust it. Her chin was up, her eyes forward, not defiant but cautious, like someone who knew every step was being counted against her. The hush in the courtroom didn't come from reverence. It came from curiosity, from that specific kind of silence people reserve for a young black girl standing alone in a place built to decide her fate. She had no lawyer beside her, no parent in the gallery. Just her name on a flickering courtroom screen, and the faint echo of heels against tile as she approached the defense table. There was no folder in her hands, no notes, no one whispering legal advice. If you looked at her from across the room, you'd think maybe she was lost until you saw her eyes. There was no confusion in them, just calculation, just quiet bracing. From the far end of the room, Officer Bradley Braun leaned back in his seat. His white uniform was pressed crisp, his arms crossed over his chest, eyes narrow. He didn't try to hide it. That smirk, the little shake of his head. He watched Amina like a man certain she belonged right where she was, and maybe worse. His presence in that courtroom wasn't about procedure. It was about power. And he knew in that moment no one was standing between him and her. The judge hadn't entered yet. The prosecutor was thumbing through papers without interest, as if this case was just another box to check. One more name, one more file. The bailiff didn't even glance at Amina as she sat adjusting the microphone slightly, her fingers laced in her lap. You could see it if you were watching closely, the way her thumb tapped against her index finger, slow and steady. She wasn't nervous. She was grounding herself, like she'd learned to breathe through the kind of storms most people never see. There was something off about that room. It wasn't just the heat. It was the way the space didn't stretch far enough for fairness. Everything felt close, too close, like judgment lived in the walls, like justice had never had a real place to stand. And as Amina sat alone at that table with her shoulders square and her gaze forward, you couldn't help but feel it, that tension, that waiting, that sense that something was already broken. No one asked if she understood the charges. No one looked twice at the fact that a minor was sitting there without representation. The courtroom moved around her like she was just a placeholder, like whatever had happened was already past tense, like she was already part of the system's paperwork. But she was breathing, she was present, and she wasn't folding in. People like Officer Braun didn't need to raise their voice to make themselves known. He just sat there, smug, confident, watching her like a man who'd already told the story and knew the ending. But there was something in the way Amina held herself even in silence that made you wonder if maybe she knew something he didn't. She didn't look at him. Not once. That kind of restraint only comes from someone who has learned exactly how dangerous a glance can be. The judge's door finally opened. The bailiff called the court to order and the room stiffened. But Amina didn't. She sat still, not frozen, not rattled, just ready. And that readiness said more than any opening argument ever could. In that moment, no one knew if she was guilty or innocent, if she had made a mistake or been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But there was a feeling, a slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. Not about her, but about everything around her. You could feel it in your gut. And the story hadn't even started yet. The room had gone cold. Not from air conditioning, it barely worked, but from the kind of chill that settled when everyone quietly agreed to let something wrong happen. The prosecutor stood up like he'd done this 100 times before, and maybe he had. Same script, same rhythm, just a different name on the docket. Today, it was Amina Jones. He cleared his throat, looked briefly toward the bench, then down at his notes like he already knew no one would question a word. The defendant is charged with obstructing a public officer and disturbing the peace, he announced. The words weren't loud, but they sliced through the still air like a verdict in disguise. Amina didn't blink. She sat motionless, hands laced in front of her until her voice cut through the courtroom with the calm edge of someone who'd already rehearsed her truth in the silence of too many sleepless nights. I was just recording. He was homeless. They were 3. No one responded. The judge didn't even look up. The prosecutor barely acknowledged the interruption. But that sentence, simple, stripped honest, hung there longer than anything else said that morning. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone shifted on the wooden bench, the creak sounding almost inappropriate in that moment. Because everyone had just heard what she said, and everyone knew what she meant. There'd been a man, unkempt black, stretched out on a park bench, half asleep in the June heat. 3 uniformed officers circled him, speaking loud, waving hands, one of them tugging at his elbow. People passed by, pretending not to see. But Amina hadn't looked away. She'd pulled out her phone, hit record, took a step closer, not in defiance, but in duty. She said one sentence, "You don't have to push him." And then everything flipped. One officer stepped back and stumbled. His heel caught the edge of a bench. He lost balance and hit the pavement hard. It didn't matter that she hadn't touched him. It didn't matter that she'd stood behind the park line. Within seconds, she was the one in handcuffs. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor flipped a page. Her actions directly interfered with officers attempting to de-escalate a volatile situation. The result was disruption, property damage, and elevated tension. It was a lie, but not the kind that needed to be believed, just the kind that sounded official enough to stand. Amina sat still, her jaw tight. Not because she was surprised, but because she wasn't. She'd seen this game before, played with her name as the pawn. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. There was no one here to speak for her, and every word would be measured against her skin, her tone, her age. So she held it in. For now. The judge finally looked up. Carol Whitmore, white mid-60s, known for her efficiency, her tight calendar, and her disdain for emotional arguments. She didn't ask Amina if she had anything to add, didn't comment on her being 17 without legal counsel. She just said, "Intent does not erase consequence." And just like that, the entire room folded in on itself, because it wasn't about what had happened. It was about what could be made to sound like it happened. It was about control, about reminding a girl like Amina that facts won't save you when the system already made up its mind. Officer Braun sat with one arm draped casually over the back of his chair. He didn't smile, but the look on his face said everything. He wasn't worried. He didn't need to be. The stage had been set, the lines rehearsed, and the audience, this courtroom, knew how to clap on cue. But there was something under the surface, a shift. Not in the law, not yet, but in the energy of the room, like some invisible thread was being pulled tighter and tighter with every word spoken, like the silence was too heavy to hold much longer. Amina didn't look back at him. She didn't raise her voice. But the air around her changed, the kind of change you don't see until it breaks. And somewhere behind those courtroom walls, the clock kept ticking toward something no one in that room was ready for. Not the judge, not the cop, not the system, because a storm was coming. And her name was already in the building. The judge called for a 5-minute recess. Just 5 minutes. Not long enough to shift anything substantial, but just enough time for something quiet and brutal to slip in unnoticed. Amina stood slowly, as if her body understood that every movement might be watched, judged, and misread. The courtroom buzzed behind her. Papers rustled, chairs creaked. The bailiff stretched, but none of that followed her out. She walked through the double doors into the hallway, where the noise died and only the soft hum of overhead lights remained. The air felt thicker out here, like it carried something no one was saying out loud. And then came the footsteps, measured, heavy, deliberate, Officer Braun followed behind her, not close enough to call it a confrontation yet, but not far enough to mistake it for coincidence. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel the heat of his gaze pressed into the back of her neck like a loaded question. He stopped just a few steps away. "You think you're brave?" His voice was low, almost amused. "You're not brave. You're a threat." Amina finally turned just enough to meet his eyes. Calm, steady. No challenge. No fear. Just clarity. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice even and clear. "I'm just not afraid to be seen." And for a second, just a second, everything went still. The hallway held its breath. Then it happened. Without warning, without hesitation, without the slightest flinch of remorse, Officer Braun slapped her. The sound echoed off the walls loud and sharp, like the crack of a judge's gavel, but far more personal. Her head jerked sideways, body staggering back into the wall behind her. Her hand came up instinctively to her cheek, where the heat bloomed like fire and her breath caught in her throat. One foot shifted to catch her balance. She didn't fall. There were no cameras in that hallway, no witnesses leaning in, no crowd to gasp, just the two of them, him and her, power and silence. He said nothing more. He didn't have to. He turned and walked away like it meant nothing. Like her pain had been a momentary inconvenience, like she was just another noise to quiet down. Amina stood there for a moment longer. Not because she was shocked, she wasn't, but because she needed to make a decision. How she would carry this. Whether she would cry. Whether she would scream. Whether she would let this change the shape of her spine. She didn't do any of those things. She wiped the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand, checking for blood. There was some. Not much. Just enough to leave a stain. She inhaled, exhaled, straightened her posture, and walked back into the courtroom like nothing had happened. But something had. When Judge Whitmore returned and called the room to order, Amina was already seated again, her back straight, her face blank. Only a faint smear of dried blood at the edge of her lip said anything out of place. No one asked about it. No one offered a tissue or a glance of concern. It was easier not to see, easier to keep the machine moving. Officer Braun sat in his usual chair, calm as ever, hands folded in front of him like a man who knew the system wouldn't blink. But Amina didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Instead, with her gaze fixed ahead and her voice barely louder than a whisper, she said something that hung in the room far longer than it should have. That was off the record, she said, but not forgotten. And somehow everyone heard her. The judge paused, pen held midair. The court reporter hesitated, unsure whether to type. Even the prosecutor shifted in his seat. Because something had cracked in the room, not loudly but deeply. A shift in gravity. A tension you couldn't name but could feel in your bones. It wasn't evidence, it wasn't testimony. It was something heavier. It was the moment everyone started realizing this girl wasn't here to survive the system quietly. She was here to expose it. When the court came back into session, it was as if nothing had happened. The judge took her seat. The prosecutor shuffled his files, and Officer Braun leaned back in his chair, relaxed as if the break had been nothing more than a trip to the water fountain. Amina sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. The faint trace of dried blood at the corner of her mouth had not been wiped away. It sat there quiet and damning, but no one said a word. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the bailiff, no one. It was the kind of silence that said more than any outcry ever could. It was the silence of a room that had witnessed something it didn't want to name, something too uncomfortable to acknowledge because doing so would mean disrupting the order. And no one in that room wanted to admit the order was already broken. Amina's eyes stayed fixed on the courtroom doors. She wasn't staring into space. She wasn't lost in thought. She was watching. Waiting. Like she knew something was coming but didn't know when. Every few seconds her fingers would tighten slightly in her lap, then loosen again. Her breath remained even, but the tension in her shoulders never left. It was like she was holding space for something the rest of us hadn't caught up to yet. Across from her, Officer Braun sat with the calm of a man who believed the moment had passed. His face was smooth, collected. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He'd already made his statement loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough for the world to ignore. and as far as he was concerned, the book was closed. But the room said otherwise. Something had shifted. You could feel it. Not in any one action, but in the stillness. It was in the way the court reporter's fingers hovered just a second longer above the keys, in the way the judge blinked more often than she had before the recess, in the way the jurors kept glancing first at Amina, then at the doors, then quickly back at their notes. And the gallery, we all felt it. There was this sense like standing outside before a summer storm breaks when the air gets thick and the birds go quiet. You know something's coming. You don't know from which direction or how loud it will be, but your skin already knows. That was the courtroom now. 5 minutes of silence that didn't feel peaceful. 5 minutes that felt like holding your breath underwater with no idea when it would be safe to come up. And yet, no one moved. No one interrupted the proceeding. No one asked the question that hung in the back of every throat. What happened out there during the break? Because to ask that would be to acknowledge it, and acknowledgement demands action. Instead, we all sat there waiting for something to snap. And still Amina never looked away from those doors. Not once. That alone told us more than any testimony could. She wasn't waiting for justice. She wasn't waiting for mercy. She was waiting for the next piece of the story to arrive like she already knew it was written, just not read aloud yet. Those 5 minutes may have passed quietly, but none of us would forget them. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. That silence was a crack in the foundation, a warning shot with no sound, and every second that passed made it harder to pretend the room was still whole. The room had been silent for too long. Too many things had gone unsaid. Too much had been swallowed down in that tight, humid courtroom where the walls seemed to sweat with the weight of everything no one dared to call out loud. Amina sat still, her face steady but pale, the dried cut on her lip catching the light like a quiet wound that had something to say. Officer Braun leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his expression smooth as ever, as if what had just happened outside that door didn't exist unless someone had the courage to name it. And then the door opened. Not a knock, not a warning, just a clean, confident swing, sharp, deliberate, like the start of something you couldn't take back. A woman stepped inside. She didn't pause. She didn't look around. She walked with the kind of stillness that made people sit up straighter. And in a room where even the air had felt heavy and one-sided all morning, she brought something that shattered every unspoken rule. She was a black woman in a crisp gray suit, not a wrinkle in sight. Her heels struck the tile like a metronome, counting down the time until something irreversible landed. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She reached into her blazer and held up a badge without saying a word. DOJ. That word alone was enough to snap heads toward her. But it wasn't just the badge. It was her presence. Cold, steady, dangerous in the way that made people with power suddenly remember where their limits were drawn. "I'm here on behalf of the Department of Justice," she said flatly, her voice low and absolute. "This courtroom is now under review." The effect was immediate. The prosecutor's hand jerked, dropping his pen to the floor with a sharp clatter. Officer Braun froze, and for the first time since Amina had walked into that courtroom, his face actually changed. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. The kind of fear that creeps up the back of your neck when you realize the game is no longer yours to play. Even Judge Whitmore blinked, the gavel she hadn't touched all morning suddenly irrelevant in her hand. No one said a word. Amina didn't lift her head. She didn't need to. Just a slight curve at the corner of her mouth, a knowing stillness in her body like she'd been sitting in silence, not waiting to be saved, but waiting for the silence to finally end. That woman, Marcia Jones, wasn't just an agent. She was her mother. And that made every second leading up to this feel like a setup the courtroom had walked right into, because they thought Amina had come in alone. A kid, powerless, easy to dismiss, easier to punish. But they never imagined her mother would be the one walking through that door, not in tears, not in panic, but in power. And it wasn't just the twist that hit the room like a punch. It was the realization that everything they thought they understood about this case, about this girl, was about to be dragged into daylight. No one moved. No one dared. Because when Marcia Jones walked into that courtroom, she didn't come for justice. She came to expose it. For a moment, it felt like the courtroom forgot how to breathe. Everything, the heat, the silence, the weight of that DOJ badge still hanging in the air was suspended. Then, without raising her voice, without stepping toward the bench, or even bothering to sit, Marcia Jones turned the entire room into a different kind of courtroom. No guardian was notified, no legal counsel present, no due process afforded to a minor, she said clearly, each word falling like a quiet verdict. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, eyes darting toward the judge like a child hoping for an adult to clean up the mess. But Judge Whitmore didn't move. She kept her hands folded, her face unreadable. Officer Braun, who had so confidently dominated the room just minutes earlier, now stared at a spot on the floor, jaw clenched, but silent. Marcia didn't wait for an answer. She didn't need one. She took another small step forward and let her gaze land squarely on the judge. Was there any notification of her mother being contacted? She refused to speak. The prosecutor muttered weakly, already on the defense. She was never read her rights, Marcia countered. She wasn't in custody. She was 17, alone, in a government building being held in a room with 2 armed officers. What else would you call it? Officer Braun broke his silence then, voice sharp, defensive. It was a tense situation. She was provoking officers. I did what was necessary. And what part of necessary includes slapping a child during recess? Marcia asked without even blinking. Because if that's part of your training manual, I'd be very interested in reviewing the section. Braun looked to the judge for support, but Whitmore raised a hand, stopping him cold. Her voice was cold, clipped. This courtroom followed protocol. Marcia held her stare. Protocol doesn't excuse neglect. It institutionalizes it. That was the moment the room shifted. It wasn't just about Amina anymore. Not about the phone. Not about the homeless man she recorded. Not even about the slap, though, that wound still sat plainly on her face like a bruise the system hoped would fade by morning. This was about something deeper, because when Marcia said those words, you could feel it settle in the back of the throat. How many times those same rules had been followed and still led to injustice? How many children like Amina had walked into courtrooms and disappeared beneath the weight of procedure? How many names had been buried under a pile of paperwork stamped case closed? Amina didn't flinch. She sat there still and composed like someone watching a storm she knew was coming. And the people in the gallery, the ones who had stayed mostly quiet up until now, began to lean in, not because they expected drama, but because they were witnessing someone dismantle a power structure without raising her voice. Marcia never touched the gavel. She didn't need to. With every question she posed, every hole she poked in the process they tried to defend, she stripped away the illusion of justice and showed the machinery behind it. And no one, not the judge, not the officers, not even the law itself, looked as untouchable as they had 10 minutes ago. No one knew what Marcia would pull out of that slim black folder she had carried in. But when she laid it gently on the table before her and opened it without a word, the air changed again, sharper this time, like it knew a secret was about to crawl out into the light. She didn't look at the judge, didn't address the courtroom. She just said quietly but clearly, "I'd like this entered into the record." There was a pause as the judge nodded almost too casually, still playing at control. And then Marcia began to read. This is an internal document circulated among district officers and school liaisons. Title, Students of Interest. Her voice remained even, like she was reading a grocery list. The criteria for this list: black students who've previously had encounters with police or posted content deemed hostile toward law enforcement. She didn't have to say Amina's name. Everyone knew. Still, she did. Page 3. Amina Jones. Flagged following a social media post showing excessive force during a hallway altercation at Westview High. Marcia paused just for a breath, but the silence that followed wasn't hers. It belonged to the entire room, like it needed that space to catch up with what had just been said. The prosecutor leaned forward, confused. This list was circulated to law enforcement. Marcia nodded slowly. And to certain judges through informal communication networks. That was when even the judge shifted hands, folding tighter. Marcia could have stopped there. She could have let the list speak for itself, let the weight of those pages crush the illusion of fairness that had been barely hanging on since Amina first walked into that courtroom. But instead, she said something that no one expected, not from a DOJ officer, not from a mother. I saw her name, months ago. When it first came across my desk, I skimmed it. I paused and I kept going. Told myself it was just bureaucracy. She looked down at Amina, not with pity, but something heavier. I said nothing. That's on me. The words landed like a quiet blow, but it wasn't the kind that made people gasp. It was the kind that left a hollow echo behind, the kind that reminded you silence can be just as dangerous as violence. Amina didn't move, didn't flinch. She just stared straight ahead, face calm, as if she had already known all along that her name had been passed around like a warning label. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was never just about her. The audience, the people in the back rows, the court clerks, even one of the younger officers who had been standing by the door all leaned in just slightly. Because this wasn't a courtroom drama anymore. It was a confession. It was a system unraveling. And the twist wasn't the slap. It wasn't even the arrival of a DOJ official. The twist was that this courtroom, this trial, this moment was just one of hundreds, maybe thousands, built not on justice, but on preemptive suspicion. Built on lists, on labels, on unchecked fear of young black kids who held up phones and asked questions. People thought they were watching a girl face a trial, but now they realized they were watching a system defend itself against the truth. That was the moment it shifted for good. When even those who had doubted Amina, who had quietly justified the charges, began to see the pattern, not just the facts. They didn't gasp. They just sat there, eyes wide open, and finally understood what it meant when a courtroom is no longer a place of fairness, but a stage for quiet erasure. Marcia didn't cry. Amina didn't shout, and no one stood up and walked out. They just listened, because in that moment the most powerful sound in the room wasn't a gavel or a raised voice. It was the sound of something rotten being named. There was a pause in the room, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from order, but from something unspoken. An air so heavy it seemed to press on every breath. Amina sat there, no longer slouched, no longer shrinking. Her shoulders were square, her back straight. Her lips were still marked with a trace of dried blood, but her eyes, those eyes were steady. And then she asked, her voice clear but not raised. "May I speak now?" It wasn't a plea. It wasn't permission she sought. It was a quiet reclaiming of space that had never been offered. The judge didn't respond, and honestly, he didn't have to. The silence was her answer. She stood slowly, not defiantly, not dramatically, just with intention. Every movement said, "I know who I am, even if none of you ever tried to." "I know this room wasn't made for me," she began. "And maybe you already decided who I am before I walked in. You saw my skin, my hoodie, my silence, and that was enough." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. The calm in her tone made the words land harder. "You judged me without hearing me. You feared me without knowing me. You punished me for not being afraid of being seen." The room was utterly still. No whisper, no cough, no shuffle. Even Officer Braun, who just hours earlier had struck her in a hallway, didn't move. He stared unmoving, but the bravado had left his shoulders. Amina took a breath. "I filmed that man because no one else would. He was thrown to the ground like he didn't matter. I thought, maybe if someone saw it, they'd care. But instead I was called disruptive, dangerous." She didn't point fingers. She didn't raise her hand to the judge or the prosecutor or the officer. She just looked at them one by one, not accusing, not begging, just seeing them, and making sure they saw her back. "For years I've been told to sit down, be quiet, stay in my place, but none of you ever asked what that place was supposed to be." She paused there, and in that pause something shifted. A sense that the room was no longer hers to survive, but theirs to reckon with. "I'm not the first black girl to be treated this way, and if nothing changes, I won't be the last. But today, I won't be silent about it." She turned slightly, not to walk away, but to show she wasn't waiting for applause. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't performing. She was being. Her final words were almost a whisper, but they landed like thunder. Silence doesn't mean safety. It never did. It just made it easier for you not to look. And then she sat down, not slumped, not shaken. She sat like someone who had finally spoken her own truth and didn't need permission to do it again. No one said anything. Not the judge, not the prosecution, not even her mother. Because in that moment, the only voice that mattered was hers. A voice the courtroom should have heard from the start. A voice justice had ignored until now, and whether or not the verdict ever changed, something else had. She was being listened to, and that changed everything. Justice didn't come with handcuffs or applause that day. It didn't slam fists or shout names. It didn't even raise its voice. It simply moved quietly, deliberately, like the sound of armor being unfastened one strap at a time. The first to feel it was Officer Braun. When the clerk returned from the hallway, he didn't bring in the next case. He brought a folded note and placed it gently on the judge's bench. A few moments later, Judge Whitmore lifted his eyes toward Braun and said without looking at anyone else, "Effective immediately. Officer Braun is suspended pending internal review." There was no outburst, no dramatic exit. The officer remained seated for a few seconds too long, as if unsure the words were real. Then he stood slowly and walked out. Not a single eye followed him. It was as if the courtroom had already moved on. Then came the second shift, quieter but just as sharp. The prosecutor, the same one who had so confidently read Amina's charges only an hour ago, now fumbled through his papers as the judge leaned forward and spoke not as a figure of authority, but as someone who had just seen a mirror turned toward himself. "This court finds cause for disciplinary review of the prosecutorial handling of this case," Whitmore said, his voice steady but no longer cold. "Particularly the use of confidential school surveillance records and prejudicial categorization of students." There was no room left to hide. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The prosecutor's hands paused mid-page, then slowly closed his file. But it was what Judge Whitmore said next that left the deepest mark. He turned to the center of the room, not to Amina, not to Marcia, but to the space between them where something invisible had finally made itself seen. "We told her to trust the system," he said, not reading from notes now, but from somewhere deeper. "But we never stopped to ask if the system ever earned that trust." The room didn't erupt, it inhaled. Even Marcia, who had spent her life in rooms like this one, felt something shift beneath the surface. Something that couldn't be filed, redacted, or denied anymore. Amina hadn't moved. But now, with no one calling her name, no one demanding she speak or defend or explain, she stepped down from the witness stand. There was nothing theatrical in it. No raised chin or triumphant pause. She simply walked down those few wooden steps and stood still in the center of the courtroom. And in that stillness, something undeniable happened. For the first time since she entered that room, Amina Jones wasn't being watched to be judged. She was being watched to be heard. No one clapped. No one whispered. But they watched her like a question that finally deserved an answer. She turned slightly, not toward the exit, not yet. Just enough to meet her mother's gaze across the aisle. Marcia didn't nod. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. There was an understanding there that stretched far beyond law, beyond protocol, beyond anything printed on paper. Because at the end of all this, after the accusations, the silence, the slap, the confrontation, Amina walked out of that courtroom, not a different girl, but one who had finally made the world listen without raising her voice. And that, more than any verdict or headline, was the beginning of justice finding its footing again. Quiet, but unstoppable. The door of the courthouse opened slowly, as if even the hinges understood something sacred had just passed through that room. The heat outside hadn't changed. It was still the same blazing sun of late June, still the same cracked pavement and humming cicadas and smell of tar in the air. But the way Amina stepped into it, it was different. She didn't rush. She didn't pause for effect. She simply walked forward with her mother by her side. No cameras, no headlines, just the sound of footsteps that didn't need permission anymore. Marcia didn't speak. She didn't reach for her daughter's hand or wrap an arm around her shoulders like someone trying to comfort a child. She didn't have to. For the first time that day, maybe the first time in a long time, she wasn't standing there as a federal official or a department voice or a woman on a mission. She was just a mother. And that was enough. The courthouse faded behind them. The building stayed the same, but what had happened inside had left a mark no plaque could record. Amina didn't look back, not even once. What was done there wasn't something to carry. It was something to walk forward from. She was still wearing the same red t-shirt, sweat-soaked at the back, a little stretched at the collar, clinging at the edges from hours under tension. It was nothing special. It didn't shine or shimmer or spell out any slogans. But it had made it through everything. The stairs, the judgment, the slap, the silence, and now the sun. Nobody stopped her now. Nobody whispered. Nobody called her names or asked what she had done to end up in that room. That shirt, the one they once used to reduce her into a type, now walked out with the weight of something they could no longer touch. They walked in rhythm, mother and daughter not speaking, not needing to. The breeze was too faint to be called wind, but it caught the corner of Amina's shirt as they passed under a tree and made it lift just for a second like it had something left to say. She didn't smile, not because she wasn't relieved, but because some victories aren't loud. Some victories don't need celebration, they need rest. The sidewalk led them out toward the street, toward the place where ordinary life would begin again, where dinner still had to be made and homework would wait and mornings would come without warning. But something had shifted. Not just in her life, not just in that courtroom. Something in the air. There would be more courtrooms, more slaps off the record, more lists like the one she was on. That hadn't changed. But something else had. A witness. Not just the people inside that room. Not just the judge or the attorneys or the ones who shuffled papers and kept time. But the people who had heard her. Really heard her. That mattered. And as they turned the corner with the courthouse now behind them, the light hit her shirt in just the right way that it stopped being a piece of fabric and became something else entirely. A statement, not stitched with anger, not printed with slogans, just worn, through it all, and still standing. And if anyone ever asked, if anyone one day wondered what justice looked like that summer, it wouldn't be a verdict, or a document, or a rule book. It would be this, a girl in red, not shouting, not shaking, just walking, just breathing. And in the quiet final line of this story before the world forgets dates and charges and court orders, there will always be this truth to return to. That summer justice didn't roar. It stood. In silence. In red. Sometimes justice doesn't come with fireworks or loud victories. Sometimes it's a girl standing her ground in silence. This story wasn't just about Amina. It was about all the quiet battles people face unseen, unheard, until someone dares to speak, until someone refuses to be erased. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel something real, please take a moment to like the video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories, where we bring you powerful human stories that linger long after the screen fades to black. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter, stories that speak when the world goes quiet. Because here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell what happened. We remember why it mattered.